Greetings, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today on our webcast. My name is Dina Evans, and I'm the Senior Manager of Global Events here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. I am very excited today about our webcast. Our topic for today is 2018 World Cup. Who will be the first to strike? And our presenter for today's webcast, we have two wonderful presenters here with us. We have Olga Polishchuk from LookingGlass, and then we also have a special guest, Rob DuBois from Impact Actual. And Olga will give us a little bit more of a formal presentation here in just a minute. But before we get started, I want to run through a very quick housekeeping notes on our Bright Talk platform for our webinar. Please make sure and note that on the screen you'll have a chat window for our audience. So feel free to submit any questions that you have for our presenters today. We'll be addressing the questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A section. If we happen to run out of time as we're going through questions, still feel free to submit them, and we'll contact you directly following the presentation to make sure that they get addressed. And also note that there's a section with attachments and links that has some great resources to peruse at your convenience that are relevant to today's topic. And also note, if you do submit any questions to our presenters, that they go directly to us. They're not viewed by the entire audience. So if you'd like anything addressed privately, please just make a note when you submit it, and we'll contact you after today's webcast. And then lastly, and very importantly, if you would like to obtain your 1 hour of CPE credit toward your professional certification for viewing today's webcast and didn't happen to enter it when you registered, you can send that to us as well through the chat feature. Just send us your membership number. It'll automatically link to whom it came from. It'll give us your name and information. So send that to us. We'll make sure that you get your CPE credit. But now, without any further delay, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to one of our presenters, to Olga, and let her take it away. Olga?
Great. Thank you so much, Dina. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Just a reminder that we do restrict this webinar to those who are registered and clear. So if you have your colleagues who are interested in this material, please access our resource page for on-demand viewing. But given some of the scenarios presented in this webinar, this is sort of a restricted audience only webinar. So my name is Olga Polishchuk. I am the Senior Director of Investigations with LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. And it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest and contributor, Rob DuBois. Rob is the founder and CEO of Impact Actual. He's also a former Navy SEAL and a Special Operations Counterterrorism Red Team advisor. So I will take the liberty of bragging a little bit on Rob's behalf. Not only Rob is a published author, he's also a perpetual agency representative to the National Counterterrorism Center, the Interagency for Intelligence Committee on Terrorism. He has background in Middle East and Russia, and he's also the Senior Policy Advisor for Deputy Secretary of Defense's Senior Integration Group. In Rob's red teaming career, there are numerous actual real-world attacks that Rob has predicted, including the Beslan attack and the Abu Ghraib prison attack. So in his red teaming role, Rob currently assists corporations nationally, internationally, and his predictive successes are very real. So welcome, Rob. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Olga.
Great. So today, Rob and I will discuss our latest publication that addresses security concerns at the World Cup, which will be hosted in Russia very soon here, starting on June 14, going through July 15, 2018. It is a high-profile event, and it's going to attract millions of tourists. It will take place at about 12 different venues across 11 cities, some of which are 100 kilometers apart, which presents an additional security challenge when it comes to attending the games or sponsoring the events themselves. So our report examines this series of events holistically. We're looking at threats and existing vulnerabilities to the event, to the public safety, touch upon cybersecurity, and of course, as always, we provide mitigation options and recommendations. And so while World Cup organizers in Russia have guaranteed the security of everybody who's attending the tournament, of course, demonstrations and protests and the threat of international terrorism, as well as kind of intensified attention to the region and the event itself coming from cyber criminals or global threat actors, has certainly presented some key concerns to the integrity and safety of the event itself. And on top of it, traveling to Russia has its own security challenges, and so travelers are, of course, advised to remain especially vigilant when visiting this country during the World Cup. So today we will focus on both physical security and cybersecurity concerns that visitors and sponsors might face, as well as provide you with an illustrative scenario of attack to really kind of contextualize some of these concerns. So if we start with the physical security side, given that Russia has a rather controversial position on many of the global events in recent years, and especially with the yet another re-election of President Putin, we assess that demonstrations and social unrest and protest activities will likely occur in and around the venues at the World Cup. Because, it's most likely that protesters and political activists will want to use the publicity of the World Cup to either demand some changes or to air grievances when it comes to Russia, FIFA, or the World Cup, because those two obviously have also controversies surrounding them and will likely be targets of protests as well. So there's a whole slew of issues that are likely to spark demonstrations, protests, boycotts. First of all, European Union boycotts. So already some countries have expressed their intent to boycott these events. And there was actually a formal call by the European Parliament that signed a letter asking the EU governments to boycott the World Cup, primarily because of the country's quote-unquote mockery of the European values, as well as recent events with poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Britain, and of course Russia's military actions in Syria and Ukraine as well. There are also some internal issues that Russia is facing right now. There has been a wave of protests in recent months with some of the anti-corruption activists and Putin opponents speaking out, namely Alexei Navalny, who has been very vocal in opposition to President Putin. He's been speaking out against the re-election of the president, the corruption, and as recently as just last month, he was actually sentenced to 30 days in jail because of an unsanctioned protest in Moscow in May. Another issue that might kind of spark some negative comments, as well as potentially some physical activity, is the LGBT activism in Russia. So there was a Russian an anti-LGBT law that was passed in 2013 by the State Duma. So this law will be challenged during the World Cup because there's already an LGBT pride house that's going to be open in St. Petersburg to offer shelter to members of the LGBT community during the World Cup. So for now, we don't have any indications that there are going to be protests or demonstrations around the opening of this facility, but it could certainly cause tensions in the Russian government because it will view this as an act of defiance against the law and perhaps even in a way an embarrassment on the world stage at the Games. And some organizations also might try to use this as an opportunity to expose Russia, to boycott companies that are associated with the World Cup, as we have seen actually occur in the lead up to the Winter Olympics in Sochi. Another issue that has been causing some discontent is animal rights. So according to animal rights activists, Russia has taken some rather drastic measures to clean up the streets leading up to the World Cup. The country allegedly spent about $1 million to poison dogs, cats, birds ahead of the game. So the animal rights groups are furious and will likely protest during the World Cup against the FIFA sponsors, the World Cup, for turning kind of a blind eye to the Russian government's actions. And finally, we can't kind of dismiss the fact that given some of the tensions and sporting rivalries, that there won't be any incidents of hooliganism. There have been already several media reports that Russian and also possibly Argentinian hooligans had already posted some death threats on web forums and social media that are specifically aimed at the English soccer fans who plan to travel to Russia. And of course, Russian government already stated that it's aware and is ready to handle the issue of hooliganism. These threats and confrontations are actually pretty common and have been violent in the past. But because of some of these controversies, we also anticipate general boycotting of the World Cup itself. But as was the case in the 2014 Olympics in Russia, and Russia also hosted 2017 FIFA Confederation Cup, security and police presence for the World Cup will certainly be prominent, especially in and around the game venues. And Robert's going to talk about it a little bit shortly, but these forces will likely quickly intervene to repress any kind of protest activities, especially because Russian government officially banned any protest activity that is not pre-approved by the government authorities during these events. And as such, Russian authorities already stated that there will be a heavy police presence around the stadium and that alcohol sales will actually also be restricted in the venues nearby to curb on some of this, the violent outbursts and perhaps hooliganism as well. In addition, pro-Kremlin paramilitary Cossack troops, which are known to use violence, will be also supplementing the traditional police forces. So we also, aside from kind of the protest activity and demonstration activity that we anticipate, there's also a moderate threat of international terrorism at the World Cup in Russia. And Rob, why would you assess the threat as moderate, and what are some of the concerns when it comes to the region and the events itself?
Thank you, Olga. Let me caveat or introduce the considerations for my calling here. Apologizing for the delay. I'm actually off the coast of Mexico on a ship right now, but hopefully the signal will come through clearly enough that we can get through this part. I would like to also follow up on what Olga said about the likelihood of hooliganism and the likelihood of terrorism. To set the stage for this, there's a significant difference between what we talk about as far as likelihood and severity. So, for example, the 1% solution by Dick Cheney back in the day with George Bush, he said we need to take any preventive action required if there's even a 1% chance of nuclear attack by terrorists. That means basically, again, the likelihood compared to the severity, because the severity is so severe. If we took down a city with a nuclear weapon, a small town, and killed 500,000 people, the the consequences would be so dire that we can't even tolerate the 1% chance of that. Contrast that with hooliganism, which is absolutely guaranteed to happen during this trip, because there are going to be some guys that sneak in and get drunk and fight. They will be in their mobs, little gangs of 5 or 10 or 15 guys from France or from England or from Germany or from Argentina, and they'll want to fight. So hooliganism, of course, is a big thing for a lot of Englishmen and some Germans and certainly Russians. So that's going to happen. It's not a possibility there will be soccer violence, but soccer violence means a broken nose. Maybe somebody will be stabbed by a bottle at the most. It doesn't mean that that dozens of people are killed by ISIS or that hundreds or thousands of people are killed by Al-Qaeda, as they would like to do, as the terrorist organizations would like to do. So that's the foundation. So the likelihood as Olga was talking about, the likelihood of terrorist attack in the World Cup is moderate, and we'll talk about a number of cases or reasons why that is the case. So its likelihood is low, but the severity is high. Olga also spoke about the reputation, the need to protect Russia's interest in terms of the optics on the world stage. And let me start going into some findings here. We started with basic assumptions. I'll get back to that, down to those, but I wanted to open up the concept with key findings we're pulling from research in terms of observation and vulnerabilities. Let me categorize these, and of course, in the end, you'll be able to look at the final report and see everything we're talking about here. But ultimately, for my background, I was the, if you will, the chief terrorist for the United States for a year, and for years before that, I was executing terrorist attacks against the U.S. In terms of red teaming, because we would notionally attack a U.S. base, find the vulnerabilities, design what we call the illustrative target to show the commander what can happen, and you'll see the illustrative target for this scenario for the World Cup is pretty dire, pretty serious. So again, low likelihood of happening, but if it did, the consequences would be ripple effects across the planet, because the whole planet is in Russia today, or will be for the event. So the observation, these are threats to property or indicator of interest, include quotes like, the primary threat of terrorism stems directly from the Islamic State and its supporters because of Russia's involvement in fighting in Syria. And teams from around the world will be arriving in groups, and they'll be wearing recognizable insignia. This is teams not only from England and Germany, but also for the fans from England and Germany in the hundreds or thousands, wearing their flags, wearing their colors. Literally, their jackets and windbreakers will be the national flag where they're coming from. It is unlikely an effective coordinated attack could be accomplished in stadiums. We'll talk about that. Gathering places and transit points around venues in Moscow, St. Pete, Rostov, and Volgograd will be at highest risk. And messages on social media sites and private chats are calling for stabbings. We'll come back to that too. Now, vulnerabilities. These mean loss of life or limb. When I'm on the road doing an assessment on a base or a corporation, these are the things that are written in big, bold red letters, because we want the clients to hear it. And we want you to hear it, because you're going to be speaking to and for and about your citizens, your employees, and others that you have some responsibility for or simply want to communicate to. As we'll talk about in the illustrative target, it's very, very important. Olga touched on this. It's very, very important that you do not release these findings beyond a controlled environment, beyond those you know that are listening to you, because you're saying, let's say, for example, I'm Acme Corp, and I want my people to know, we have 500 people going to Russia and to be in Moscow. We want our 500 people to be aware these things could happen. Do tell them to watch out for this and that. Do tell them to take these precautions as recommended. Do not tell them this is the scenario that could happen. And I want to emphasize that. I'll say it again before I read the illustrative target to you. The reason for this is because our illustrative target is an attack plan. It's a blueprint for how to choreograph an effective terrorist attack. When I do these things for the U.S. government, they're highly classified, but we are not using classified information in this case, and so the findings are just highly sensitive, not classified, and you'll see why as we get to that. But back to vulnerabilities. Knife attacks and vehicular attacks represent the likeliest threat, and let me categorize that. Knife attacks are slashings or stabbings, pretty obvious. It's going to get a little uglier, though. Be prepared for that when I get to the scenario. A little uglier than stabbing. Vehicular attacks, you've seen that, and to repeat again what Olga said about my experience, and I guess I've done about 100 sites and 100 interests, 100 organizations around the world in the past 15 years. My predictions are good. So this is already being planned, very likely. The reason that it will hopefully not happen is because of the precautions taken by the security forces in Russia. They're very, very effective. They're very harsh. They're very unforgiving when they suspect somebody wants to do violence. The Russian forces as a culture are ready to do violence in return. So the vehicular attacks, which I did predict before they began happening in the U.S., mean simply overrunning, to use your car or truck, the biggest you can, and mow down the most concentrated batch of human beings as it can be found within a vulnerable place for you to drive through. Crowds on the street, for example. A block party would be ideal. And also, I want to caveat here, if I sound enthusiastic about doing any of these attacks, it's not because I personally am. Rob DuBois is opposed to harming innocents, and that's why I was dedicated my career to protecting them. But as a professional, I have to put my mind in the mind of the adversary, and I have to think about it in terms of this is a really good attack, a good opportunity. So when I speak of vehicular attacks, I'll describe it very practically as how we want to do it, we the terrorists. Foreign fans in large groups on the streets or in squares and parks will be vulnerable to vehicular assault. Experts assess that any potential attacks would be carried out by lone wolf actors. And harming visitors in towns hosting games, even miles away from stadiums, still counts, using air quotes. It still counts. And I say that from the perspective of the terrorist agenda. Let me categorize that a little bit. When we do the assessment, you may have heard the term sheepdogs, that the security guys around the world, the people like me, former GIs, are out there right now being sheepdogs and protecting the flock. My perspective on red teamers like myself is that we're not sheepdogs, we're not protecting the flock, we're reformed wolves, because it takes a wolf to stop a wolf, it takes a thief to stop a thief. And in this case, I have to look at the threat like a terrorist, like what would I want to do? How would I like to kill people or maim or destroy property? And from the terrorist perspective, anything that's spectacular is going to be a win. If, as we point out shortly, I can kill 20 people and injure 50, and it's from multiple countries, and it's got cameras everywhere, 1 million video cameras will be filming this thing, and I win. As you'll see. So from the perspective of the terrorist, you don't have to be in a stadium. You don't have to be with stabbing a person with the backdrop as the kissy cam over the stadium where people's trying to get married and have proposals. Okay, so yeah, the primary threat of terrorism does come from the Islamic State because they are the active terrorist group on the world today. It is, yes, Al-Qaeda still exists in the world, however, they're not a player as it stands because in this case, they're not the likeliest to go after this scenario. Russia, the ISIS supporters around Southeast Asia and other areas have posted posters, as you'll see in your report, including one warning Russia will participate in the World Cup, but with bombs and explosive belts. Good luck with that, ISIS. It's an editorial comment from Rob DuBois because bombs and explosive belts are not going to get very far into the stadiums because if you look like you're from out of town, you're already in crosshairs. There's 20 cops looking at you right now that you can't see. And if you try to wear your big bulky vest into the stadium or even get within a mile of the stadium with a big bulky vest on foot, you're going to have a lot of attention. And probably the youngest guy on the cop force is going to be forced to walk over and confront you because when you blow up, they'll take him or you'll take him with you. Okay, so the risk at the World Cup is heightened given Russia's involvement in fighting Islamic State. We've touched on that. That includes also the Russian republics of Chechnya and Dagestan. They have a history of attacking football matches, events, wherever you can get a bunch of people together having fun. That's what terrorists like to attack because they don't like having people having fun. Note that public and private organizations that monitor terrorist groups have not found direct threats from the Islamic State's leadership or official media outlets toward the World Cup. This is important. This is not people who stand in the sandals of al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. This is not people in Syria and in Iraq saying, "Let's go blow up the soccer players," because they're busy getting their asses kicked. To be frank, the actual ISIS main is being battered severely because of heavy pressure from the U.S. and other forces. However, again, this is about lone wolves, which ISIS main has encouraged to go after good guys anywhere. We're the good guys. And those bad guys are saying, go kill them where you can. They refer to particularly violent Quranic phrases like strike the neck of the disbelievers, of the unbelievers. So there are plenty of individuals who are motivated to do what they can. But if you have trouble getting an 8-inch knife blade past the security forces, because again, you look a little funny and they are not squeamish at all about profiling in Russia, I guarantee. This is a place that is unlike America in the sense that there's very limited limitation on profiling and going after people just because you suspect something about them. civil rights are a much lower priority when it comes to national security in Russia than they are in the U.S., and also the fact that this is such a high-profile thing. We'll have dozens of nations represented. In other words, the world is in Russia, and now a place, if we could coordinate, we the terrorists could coordinate an attack, we would love to do so. We'd love to hit everybody. That's why the World Trade Center was attacked, because it was a symbol of attacking the world. All the unbelievers globally were struck at one moment, and this is a sweet moment for that symbolic attack in Russia for ISIS. The concern is amplified by the potential for Russian jihadists returning from conflict zones. There are approximately 3,400 individuals who have been estimated to have left Russia over the past few years to go support ISIS, and there is concern, like there is in every country that spawned a number of ISIS players, that they're coming home. Now, let me put that in perspective. It is very hard if you've been flagged as an ISIS supporter who drove away or flew away to go attack unbelievers in Iraq or Syria, to come right back through the border with your little passport and say, I'm coming home, I want to be a shoemaker again, because they'll, the forces will, the security forces will say that that's not cool, we don't want you back in our country, or, yeah, we'll take you back into custody, and it's going to be really ugly for you. Now, let me go ahead to the assumptions. In attacking this problem, we set certain assumptions regarding terrorist threats in Russia. These are the thinking points that went into it, and it's a very subjective list of items, including the Russian state can be brutal against perceived threats to its control. Olga already mentioned that Russia assassinates its own citizens abroad in our countries. England, of course, is a hot spot right now for frustrations for a sovereign nation that Russia would take such illegal actions on its soil. And to protect its members, the Russian state is extremely invested in identifying and eliminating threats. This, again, back to saving face, back to making an appearance. The Russian state is placing additional controls on foreigners' access to World Cup cities, and except for the rare Caucasian, most ISIS operatives will stand out within ethnically white Russia regions. ISIS would highly value a spectacular attack against the unbelievers from across the world in Russia. Note that I'm not saying this is a pro or con when it comes to an attack happening in Russia. These are a long subjective list of basically whatever points may matter regarding its likeliness, the likelihood or the lack thereof for a terrorist attack in Russia. We're talking about assumptions that frame the discussion and frame the search. ISIS is threatening to attack in Russia because of Russia's involvement in Syria. ISIS' main resources are severely constrained by territorial losses. Lone wolves represent the most likely threat from a terrorism perspective. Inspired lone wolves could execute knife and vehicle attacks in multiple locations simultaneously. Keep that in mind. Hooligans, Russian, English, German, are a threat to order, but not a large-scale terrorist concern. Again, it's insignificant from a terrorist or anti-terrorism officer like myself. We don't care about hooligans. The cops will take care of them. They'll crack some heads, and hooligans will punch people in the nose, but they will not murder thousands of people as the terrorists would love to do. And finally, delivery of any serious weapons into the stadiums is unlikely. Now let's talk about critical assets. When I do my assessments for the U.S. government, we have 4 categories. Threats and critical assets are 2 of them. That means what can get us and what do we not want got. What do we want to protect, the critical assets. We'll come to the threats in a moment. The critical assets to protect from the perspective of the Russian government include reputation for robust security and protection of guests, the athletes and staffs for all World Cup teams, foreign fans by the thousands, hundreds of thousands, a million potentially, and properties and equipment. I mentioned threats. Actual terrorist capabilities to harm targets consist of the following types of threats: knife attacks, vehicular attacks, which is overrun, driving over crowds, small arms tactics, firearms and grenades, potentially, large explosive attacks, which is unlikely in the areas of the games because of the extreme focus on security, hostage taking. Imagine the Munich games when the Israeli hostages were Israeli players, athletes were taken hostage, and CBR or chemical, biological, radioactive attacks, which are highly unlikely with the exception of repurposing existing commercial chemical storage, for example, near the attack site. I've used in my scenarios, I've used existing warehouses that included high volumes of bleach or chlorine or other chemicals that could be compromised in an explosive spill, for example, plumes that would injure people by lungs in their breathing. So again, large explosive attacks are unlikely. Hostage taking is potentially likely, but why bother? It's not. They can't. We're not as complacent or unprotected as in Munich so many years ago. And CBR, chem bio radioactive, is highly unlikely because the weapons. It's going to be hard to get a knife into the stadium, much less a nuclear bomb or a radioactive explosive. Finally, vulnerabilities. This is where we compare the threats, existing real threats that could happen, against existing real critical assets we have to protect. Foreign visitors in towns hosting games across the country are vulnerable, even miles from the stadiums, because, again, it still counts for the news. We want a spectacular attack on the terrorist side. Another vulnerability is teams in transit to and from regional stadiums. So I'm thinking as a terrorist that I want to go after people wearing the British flag or the German flag, whoever I want to go after if I can. This includes a lot of moms and dads and kids wearing their colors for their state. But if I can get a team, I'm going to be much more excited about that. It's a juicier attack because I'm getting the actual official representatives of that country, if you understand what that means. So football teams around the world are arriving in groups wearing recognizable insignia, and terrorist spotters at air and rail hubs could call ahead to alert ambushers to intercept them along their routes. Note, this is my first official inject point to warn you, this must not be shared beyond your actual audience, for your corporation, for your association, whoever you are. The reason you're listening to this, the reason you're tuning into the LookingGlass presentation, this is the first indication of, first example of things that I want you to be very careful about. Protect this, because you, as a representative of your organization, do not want bad guys getting good ideas. And it's a very good idea to put a terrorist spotter at an air and rail hub, one at the airport, by the taxi stands, in a taxi, driving a taxi, or at rail hubs, just reading a newspaper along the side of the road and watching and said, okay, great, the German team just arrived. They're about to get into a big shuttle bus. That big shuttle bus is about to drive 4 miles across town to get to the stadium, or the stadium lodging, and now's a good time to attack. A couple of AK-47s could do a real mess on a big soft bus full of teammates. Okay, next point, foreign fans in large groups on the streets are vulnerable in squares and parks, around Red Square, of course. Vehicular assault is optimal for that scenario. So if they're in a big bunch of foreign fans wearing their little German or English flags, that's going to be a sweet target for me and my terrorist big van or truck. Even a sedan can do an awful lot of damage if it's mobile and has a huge space to mow people down. And stadium attendees. Theoretically, attendees are vulnerable to explosives, small arms, and hostage taking. It is unlikely an effective coordinated attack could be accomplished given the event's heavy security. Finally, before the scenario, some concern strategies and mitigation of terrorist threats. Russia has been planning and coordinating World Cup 2018 security for many years. 2 years at least. It's been recorded as far as 2 years ago. The articles were speaking to the fact that Russia was preparing for this to happen. I want to keep this in mind. As I said earlier, I'm looking at pros and cons. We're looking at all factors that can contribute to a terrorist attack. I want people to be thinking about this. And for ethnic Arab and Central Asian violent extremists, like the Uzbeks that I worked with a few years ago, Russia, as we all know, is a very white country in terms of Russian ethnicity. It doesn't mean there are not other ethnicities in Russia. However, the reality is, compared to America and other countries, or some other countries, racism from the white population is a regular present factor, and violence from the whites, on stomping in the back bars is a thing. So ethnic Arab and Central Asian violent extremists will be observed by the existing discrimination or element of discrimination from the police forces, security forces in Russia. And of course, Olga did mention the paramilitary forces who will be supplementing the official forces, and the potential for being recognized as a guy sneaking into town and trying to go attack other people of any ethnicity it'll be much harder. I actually pity the guys that are trying to come in and don't look like a big, tall, blonde Russian. It'll be tougher to get near targets. But there are plenty of people who are already in the towns where the stadiums are. So it's not like an actual sea of white. We're not talking about Iceland here. We're talking about a bunch of people who are the people on the street will be largely Caucasian. However, there are other ethnicities already present. But when the security force is already on high alert, this is the time they'll be looking especially at folks like that, and so it'll be harder for a guy to come in from Oman or from Uzbekistan and do some mischief. Next point, the Sunni extremist threat is highlighted because of ISIS returnees from Iraq and Syria. Sprawling cities around the stadiums could allow a variety of desirable targets. Think about the expansion factor. Think about stepping away from the stadium by 1 mile or even 1 kilometer. Anybody who knows a little bit about math understands that as you increase that radius and the diameter, you multiply the square footage, if you will, the square meterage. So it's harder for the security forces to protect much beyond the kilometer, the 2 kilometers beyond from the stadium, because you're expanding the territory so radically. So if I'm a bad guy, I'm going to be looking at a band of 3 or 4 kilometers from the stadium. I'm going to be looking at a bigger swath that's harder to protect, and I'm going to be looking for the fun-loving fans who are out there wearing their German flag hoodies, and I'm going to look for them in a big mob, hanging out and enjoying, going to get some borscht and maybe look for Matryoshka dolls, and I'm going to get them with my car or my knife. We'll come to that. There are rigorous anti-terror measures, including total ban of planes and flying devices or like drones around the stadiums, control forbidden zones in venue cities, stringent ID checks, massive restrictions in sales of arms, explosives, poisons. These are all measures being taken by the Russian government over the past couple of years. Closure of factories, manufacturing dangerous goods, strict restrictions on selling and consuming alcohol, bans on movements of boats and ships near the stadiums, and road closures and high security on trains and planes. Again, on the vehicles, on the planes and trains, there will be a high measure of security. But if somebody wants to be creative and get near those hubs and watch off of them and watch for them trying to transit to their safe point at the stadium, that's the most vulnerable stretch, is in transit for the official guys and anybody out in town for the unofficial guys like the German and French visitors. Arrival of foreign visitors is being closely tracked is another observation we had. There are unique identification cards being required to get into the stadiums to observe. So again, there's another limitation, we call it LIMFAC, or limiting factor, to keep bad guys out of the stadiums. Volunteers are being strictly vetted. And there's this, finally, as Olga mentioned, a separate security concern for British citizens because of the tensions between London and Moscow. When we have Russians being murdered on British soil and it's a worldwide news, there's going to be some diplomatic tension. Okay, now switch gears and put on your storytelling or story listening hat, if you will. This is where we're going to flow from all the facts I've presented, all the facts Olga has presented so far, the observations that are pro and con terrorist attack, that are observations and vulnerabilities in terms of what can cause life and limb loss. And I want to use or show you what can happen and why it's so important that you do communicate to those that you're responsible for and offer them the mitigating recommendations we've talked about, which we'll get to at the end after you've heard the awful scenario that can happen. And I'll go through this verbatim. Caveating one more time, this is an illustrative target, a vulnerabilities-based scenario which could reasonably occur if the identified vulnerabilities are not mitigated. Mitigating options are presented following. The post-attack scenario review, notionally recorded 4 weeks after the Moscow terror attack. So imagine this is a month following the opening games. Through private chat rooms and direct messages among European-based ISIS sympathizers, a plan was communicated that invited lone wolf violent extremists to conduct knife and vehicle attacks. Wherever possible, these should occur in and around Moscow, generating a maximum density of spectacle and terror. If a willing brother or sister under God were unable to make it to Moscow, he or she should strike in any other World Cup city, preferably at the same time as the attacks in the capital. The scheduling of this attack was set for noon Moscow time on the day following the opening game. The one-day delay would allow for some possible relaxation on the part of local security forces who would presumably be at their highest level of alertness during initial ceremonies. The noon hour was selected for its dual benefit of representing a moment of judgment, high noon, and because it would simplify coordination for all attackers. Willing participants were urged in this one-day jihad not to attempt to enter the stadiums for fear of being intercepted. Rather, the suggestion among ISIS communicators was to seek and monitor pockets of foreigners within 2 or 3 miles of the stadium, expanding the territory security forces would have to monitor. Similarly, to ensure operational security, participants were urged not to share this plan except with absolutely trusted fellow believers, who might also be willing to make this ultimate sacrifice. Every prospective participant was informed that he or she should be prepared for this to be the final act of martyrdom, because armed security would be patrolling heavily. Anyone able and willing to conceal a large knife and move in among foreigners in public was invited to strike unilaterally. Anyone acting alone and unable to locate foreigners by the appointed hour should strike local Russians, whether associated with the games or not. By granting this permission, ISIS communicators hope to focus their impact as much as possible, while simultaneously expanding the opportunity and therefore the terror value to every willing actor across Russia. Everyone involved would keep a note in his or her pants pocket furthest from the likely bullet impact points and the corresponding bloody mess, with this simple message, quote, "For the innocents murdered in Syria," end quote. The ideal attack scenario where small teams of 2 or 3 could work together was conveyed to be a combined vehicle knife attack. Each autonomous team should prepare an ordinary passenger vehicle which would not attract attention in the city and choose a suitable area. Only the driver would be in the auto, while knife attackers would position themselves in nearby crowds and wait for vehicle attack. Once security forces and witnesses were fully distracted by responding to a vehicular emergency, knife attackers would begin stabbing a small group of victims, please note the small, selected for their distraction and relative isolation from other pedestrians. Knife attackers had one additional instruction discussed below. At noon on that second day, a total of 15 attackers struck. 13 were in Moscow and 1 in each of the 2 other World Cup cities. Of those in Moscow, 3 teams of 2 persons each conducted combined vehicle knife attacks in 3 areas of the city. 7 others acted alone. According to the plan, each of the 3 vehicle operators drove through normal traffic until he got near a small group of foreigners, at which point he accelerated as fast as possible, steered off the road into crowds, and drove over as many people as possible, to ultimately crash into obstacles before being pulled from their cars and beaten to death by outraged witnesses. The third managed to speed away and run down 4 additional victims before being shot to death by police a few minutes later. The knife attackers had one unusually grim task. Rather than stabbing and slashing as many victims as possible before being stopped, as has happened in most other knife attacks in recent years, they had been directed to not only stab at least one person, but to sever that victim's head. This was the ultimate point of what has come to be called the Moscow Massacre in the weeks since. ISIS communicators were adamant in urging the faithful to conduct this horrifying detail, exhorting participants to follow the edicts to, quote, "strike the unbelievers at the neck," end quote. Planners believed the worldwide impact of showing a few decapitated victims lying beside slain and, quote, "courageous," end quote, mujahideen would create a massive ripple effect. They were right. News coverage about the atrocity has been nonstop for a month. Images of the headless bodies of victims and, quote, "heroic," holy warriors, who faced overwhelming firepower with only a knife, are all over the internet, despite the major networks refusing to show such disturbing images. Neighboring countries have geared up for stricter security policies in their own metropolitan areas. Popular anti-immigration movements are soaring. Violence against non-whites is at an all-time high in Russia, and in 2 of the nations whose citizens were killed during the attacks, nationalist leaders have already been voted into office. In all, 8 victims were killed and 19 wounded by vehicular attack, and 11 were killed and 4 wounded by knife attack. 7 of those murdered were also successfully decapitated. 13 attackers were killed by onlookers and security forces. 3 remain in custody and interrogation because they were not a part of any organization. They have nothing of value to expose. This is the horrible vulnerability to us of lone wolf attackers, that they can be inspired without command. The World Cup games were crippled for a few days to follow, but recovered enough to be played out to their conclusion. Severe curfews and spontaneous interrogation policies were established in Moscow and St. Petersburg, creating frightening and humiliating encounters for thousands of foreign visitors who are now posting their experiences with Moscow's finest for millions to read through social media. President Putin considers this to be one of the most damaging events of his long rule, and uninvolved Muslims in Chechnya and across Russia are beginning to feel the retribution of the Kremlin. Finally, ISIS is boasting that the terror group is back on the map, having struck the evil Russia and also 6 other unbelieving nations of the world, all in one glorious hour-long celebration of God's love for the faithful. It is estimated that between 7,000 and 10,000 individuals worldwide have pledged allegiance to ISIS since the murders. Okay, how do we stop this? I'll run over quickly, and when you get your report, you can read these things verbatim and apply them. Lone wolf attackers. It's impossible to prevent every motivated lone wolf, but countermeasures include security forces watch especially for single males acting out of the ordinary. Visitors remain in the immediate vicinity of the stadiums where security is highest. Visitors remain near security forces. Attackers prefer to not be stopped immediately. And visitors maintain situational awareness and avoid congregating in large groups in public. Knife attack. The knife attack is very challenging to manage. Countermeasures include security forces watch especially for single males, possibly with one hand concealed. If I'm holding a knife that I want to use for slaughtering the unbelievers, just like I read about in my holy book, I'm going to have a big knife, and I'm going to have to kind of keep it not visible to the good guys, from my perspective, the bad guys called Russian cops. Visitors maintain situational awareness and avoid congregating in large groups in public. Security forces in home nations educate the visitors about maintaining awareness. And for the vehicle overrun threat, finally, crowds exposed to vehicular traffic are most vulnerable to this tactic. Countermeasures include security forces monitor vehicle operators in areas frequented by World Cup guests. Visitors gather only in smaller groups when outside stadiums. Visitors not wear clothing or gear which highlights foreign citizenship. And visitors stay close to the stadiums and maintain distance from other groups of foreign guests. This concludes the terrorism threat portion of our briefing, and I'm going to hand it back to Olga to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate your insight. This is definitely a very real security concern, so we are very thankful for all the possible scenarios and some of the considerations for the teams as well. Thank you. And of course, aside from the groups that Rob has mentioned, and aside from the lone jihadis, the major international events like the World Cup have usually drawn interest of also cyber criminals and hacktivists and cyber terrorists, and even to a lesser extent cyber espionage actors. So according to our assessment, while there is obviously a credible cybersecurity threat to the games, cyber criminals remain to be the most pervasive threat to the games, followed by hacktivists and much lesser extent cyber terrorists and cyber espionage actors. So of course we can expect a whole slew of cyber criminal activities surrounding the games, and this kind of mirrors what we have seen in the South Korea Winter Olympic Games, where cyber criminals are both kind of innovative in their attacks that are going both for financial gain, reputational damage, and so on, but also using their kind of tried and true methods to continue successfully exploit the attendees, sponsors, and just citizens in general. And some historic cybercrime activities did take place during World Cup previously in Brazil. In 2014, cybercrime activity primarily involved kind of use of adware, phishing attacks, banking trojans. In South Africa, 2010, we have seen spam emails being a major tactic used by cyber criminals. Emails like the lottery and the ticket distribution were very prominent and kind of engaged customers for a fraudulent fund transaction. And to provide some comparison, Brazil hosted the World Cup in 2014, and it sort of has been a national leader in cybercrime activities and a leader in internet fraud as well, primarily going after the financial gain. There were about 1 million cyber attacks that were recorded in Brazil in the 2014 time period. And of course, not everything was related to the World Cup, but there was definitely an intensified frequency of attacks for the event itself. And similarly, Russia, which also has a very robust and sophisticated cyber criminal underground with actors who are really famous for, at this point, kind of creating new tools and engaging in services to other hackers or threat actors, which would be a credible threat. So it is generally perceived that these cybercriminal elements operating in Russia are perhaps in the Russia's sphere of influence and could evade government's attention as long as they do not attack Russian targets. And while many of the World Cup sponsors and partners are international companies, their targeting would be specifically more technically acceptable. However, Russia is hosting the games, and as Rob has mentioned, a Russian government may exert some pressure against even these ethnic cyber criminals not to target World Cup related organizations or sponsors, sort of to create this facade that Russia is safe and is in control of its cyberspace. But we can certainly expect, and we have already seen some schemes like fake domain names, where cyber criminals have registered at least 1,500 domains at this point that are designed to specifically target the FIFA World Cup and Russia, just blatantly using the names of the events, host cities, years, and so on. Mobile banking. Russian and other criminals obviously frequently used mobile banking to plant malware, to extort credentials, steal information from bank customers, so we can certainly see that continue. Skimmers, both point-of-sale skimmers, that is sort of like a legitimate transaction, and also ATM skimmers, where criminals have been known to kind of purchase decommissioned ATMs, install skimming devices, all in an effort to get information and steal money. Rewards points. As any event, World Cup will draw a lot of international travelers, so cyber criminals are taking advantage of reward sites, accessing them via compromised bank accounts and credit cards to kind of steal these points for their own personal use as well. So in our report, we also provide some digital safety tips to remain safe and secure while traveling. And certainly Rob has mentioned a series of physical security preventative measures that one can take as well. Another group that we're looking out for are hacktivists, because obviously hacktivists are drawn to large events because of targeting of companies that sponsor or maybe supply global sporting events, so to say, generate some support for their political and ideological platforms so they can publicize their message. The hacktivists have constantly used DDoS attacks and have attacked websites of countries that are perceived as violating human rights, or countries engaging in censorship, and so on. And of course, data compromise is always a concern, and there are several common TTPs leveraged by a lot of these actors to compromise and steal data. We have listed some of them on the slide in front of you. I'm not going to get into all of them, but I do want to point out that a watering hole attack tactics is where where hackers compromise a website that they know that their target audience will visit. They reconfigure the code, download malware on the victim system, and then enable it to kind of take control of the system, or at least to steal the data from it. And in this instance, hackers may turn to World Cup related sites and turn these sites or media sites even into watering holes. And interestingly enough, in writing our report, our analysts actually identified several vulnerabilities present on several FIFA's subdomains. Some of them are actually ticketing subdomains that could be exploited to steal data from the attendees. Some other schemes that we will probably see during the games would be the false flagging of Wi-Fi, spear phishing, actual even physical theft of computers and devices. And when it comes to just staying safe during the games, we have already spoken about physical security tips and elements that you can follow to protect yourself and your customers and your employees. There's also a series of digital safety tips that we will publicize and we have made available in our paper, so feel free to refer to the document as well. At this point, this concludes our presentation, and thank you very much for your attendance and your interest in our subject matter. And thank you, Rob, very much for your contributions as well.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it very much. And we only have a few minutes left in the hour. I know there were some questions that did come in, but unfortunately we are running out of time because you guys were wonderful providing really great content today. So I do want to thank you for that. And I am going to wrap up today's presentation, and definitely thank you to everyone in the audience for viewing today's presentation. If you have any colleagues that you feel that would benefit from seeing this presentation on demand, please contact us. Or there will also be a sign-up page on our resources, the resources page on our website, where they can also view this after the fact. And if you'd like to contact us with additional questions, you can do that. There's some contact information on this final screen with our social media as well as our website. And also in your attachments and links section for the audience, there's a contact us page. But again, thank you so much, and thank you to Olga, and thank you to Rob for today. We greatly appreciate having you with us. Thank you both, and that concludes today's presentation.